Hey, it's Dr. K. I'm a California licensed naturopathic doctor and certified sacred medicine woman. Welcome to the Divine Woman Wellness Podcast. This is a show about whole body wellness that is going to support you in finding alignment with your body, mind, and spirit. I believe every woman should have a deeper understanding of her body and soul, and my mission on this show is to guide you through learning about your body, how you can shift your day-to-day life to support health and wellness, while connecting to yourself on a deeper level. These episodes are rooted in naturopathic medicine, vitalism, biohacking, and mysticism, and will guide you towards well-being in body, mind, and soul. Thank you for being here. Let's dive in. Hello, my loves, and welcome back for another episode of the Divine Woman Wellness Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic that I see very often in my office, and I think a topic that is misunderstood or at least not fully understood. And so today, we're going to talk a little bit more about estrogen dominance and what is estrogen dominance, where does it come from, how do we get rid of it, and also how is it impacting our life. So this is a topic by special request, and I love that my community is engaging with me and that I'm getting these requests for specific topics. So thank you all for listening, and I'm so excited. I actually have this new microphone. It's so cute and fuzzy. It makes me really happy, so I hope the audio quality continues to improve. So let's dive in and talk about estrogen dominance. So what is estrogen dominance? Well, estrogen dominance can be defined in many different ways. And so we have estrogen that is imbalanced to progesterone usually, and that's what we see as estrogen dominance. Now, throughout the entirety of our cycle, we won't have higher levels of progesterone like we do in our luteal phase. So during the follicular phase, those first 2 weeks of our menstrual cycle, we actually have estrogen that slowly rises, peaks right before ovulation, and then comes down during ovulation, and then slowly rises and has a second peak in the mid luteal phase. So let's talk about estrogen dominance and what it is in the follicular phase. So during this time, what I see most often as estrogen dominance is actually an out of reference range level of estrogen. So your body is making more estrogen than is desirable, right? These reference ranges are cutoffs because that's what's physiologically normal. Now, depending on what time of the month you've had your labs drawn, this is important to take that into consideration because you'll see in the reference ranges that they're different, and different labs have a different way of listing it, but usually you're looking for follicular phase, which would be day 1 through 14. As the reference range for the follicular phase. Now, estrogen dominance in the luteal phase, this is where it gets a little bit more tricky because there's many different ways that it can manifest. So during the luteal phase, that second half, we usually like to compare estrogen or estradiol specifically to progesterone. And we want to have the right balance there. So I generally run labs cycle day 19 through 21, which is that peak luteal phase of both progesterone and estrogen, which gives us the opportunity to actually do the calculation and assess for estrogen dominance. Before we ever get there, though, same thing here is the estrogen within the reference range and making sure you look at the reference range for cycle days 19 and beyond. Right? Because it does fluctuate throughout. And so if we look at an ovulation range for estrogen, that's going to be different. So for this podcast, we're going to focus mostly on the luteal phase. So now if your estrogen is frankly outside of the reference range and is elevated, that is a true estrogen dominance. What I also see is more often a progesterone deficiency, which then creates a relative estrogen dominance. So what this means is we have a relatively normal amount of estrogen, and usually it's more on the, halfway to higher side normal estrogen levels in the lab work. And then we have a deficient progesterone. So the body, the corpus luteum, the part of the egg release, right? When our ovary releases the egg, the part that's supposed to produce the progesterone is not producing enough progesterone. So then we have it's a progesterone deficiency, creating a relative estrogen dominance. And we can have both occurring at the same time. So you can have the estrogen elevated outside of reference range, and we may have a progesterone that's nice and high, and so the progesterone to estrogen ratio may be okay, but we still have an out of reference range estrogen dominance. That would still create symptoms for most women. So now when we have estrogen that is high even within that reference range, but we have a progesterone that's really low in the reference range, that relative difference still creates a relative estrogen dominance. And that's what I see a lot of times. And usually this comes along with a shorter cycle, or premenopausally when our cycles are getting a little shorter, more irregular, or in times of high stress. This presents often because our body, again, is not going to try to procreate. So do we even release that? Do we actually ovulate that month? And that's important for producing progesterone. So that's a little overview in terms of estrogen dominance. And I do think it's really important to have the understanding of estrogen and how it cycles throughout our menstrual cycle, and that there are different times of the cycle that can produce different symptoms. And there's a myriad of different symptoms. So the most common symptoms that I see with estrogen dominance, and a lot of times I do see this also with relatively normal estrogens, but a progesterone deficiency. But we're going to focus primarily on estrogen dominance because this is usually the driver of these symptoms. Anxiety, mood swings, even depression. Think of PMS. PMS is a good one to think of with this estrogen dominance. Actually, a decreased libido, and that's usually because the estrogens are imbalanced. And we didn't even talk about estrone, your E1. So we have two primary types of estrogens. Let's back up there a little bit. So we have estrone and estradiol. For the ratios, we generally most often look at estradiol. I also like to compare estrone to estradiol. I would like to have them relatively similar in number, but there are times where estradiol E2 is actually within normal ranges and estrone E1 is really high, and that's actually because there's a misconversion from testosterone and estradiol over into E1, your estrone. So this is where a decreased libido comes in, dry eyes, dry skin, fat gain, adipose tissue, especially around the midsection, think kind of cortisol related, weight gain, hips, thighs, that's where we gain that fatty tissue. And that's usually part of the driving force as well. So I think a lot of times we hear estrogen dominance and weight gain, and we think it's the estrogen that's driving the weight gain. And in a way it is. It is actually driving it through inflammation. However, fatty tissue also becomes its own endocrine system. So it's actually releasing estrogen, and therefore it's also contributing. So it really does become a bit of a catch-22. Fatigue, low energy can be a sign of estrogen dominance, fertility issues, and this is where more of the progesterone deficiency comes in. But things like endometriosis, polycystic ovarian syndrome or PCOS, uterine fibroids, I see this so often as related to estrogen dominance. Headaches, migraines, those are some really common symptoms when women come in and they have headaches, especially if they're cyclical headaches or headaches associated with your menstrual cycle, and same with migraines. I most often suspect estrogen dominance, and then we treat the estrogen dominance, and that does help improve those symptoms. Insomnia, sleep problems. So estrogen can be very stimulating. So even though it's causing fatigue, think that irritability, that restless mind racing, that can be a sign of estrogen dominance, as well as progesterone deficiency. So this is where it's so important to not just treat estrogen dominance, but have a better understanding as to what kind of estrogen dominance are you experiencing. Again, the true out of reference range estrogen dominance, in which case we need to lower the estrogens, or are you experiencing normal estrogen with low progesterone? And then we want to bring up the progesterone so that we find balance. Otherwise, we'll always be out competing one another with estrogen and progesterone trying to find a balance, but we're not able to locate which one it is truly. So back to PMS symptoms. So these painful periods, irregular periods, heavy periods, very, very significant PMS symptoms, especially when you're younger in age. We see this a lot more often, that the PMS symptoms are related to estrogen dominance, and that's because your body's still learning the balance. But as I discussed in some of my previous episodes with toxins and your hormones, there are xenoestrogens or even toxicants that promote estrogen dominance. And so I see that more and more in my younger population of females, where we're having more hormonal disruption because of these endocrine disruptors that are really driving estrogen dominance. And now that I've done the analysis in the podcast on the feminine hygiene products and the toxicants, that also can drive local estrogen dominance and inflammation. So estrogen dominance, painful periods, irregular or heavy periods are very related to inflammation. Poor muscle tone is a surprising one, but if you're having a hard time getting good muscle tone, that may be a sign of estrogen dominance, because estrogen dominance, or estrogen, not the dominance, but the estrogen actually is designed to prepare our body for pregnancy. So we're going to make sure we have nutrient balance, but we're not going to be as focused on muscle development. I see a lot of puffy faces, bloating, specifically with estrogen dominance, kind of the swollen, puffy look. What I also see with estrogen dominance, and sometimes this is a consequence of estrogen dominance, is actually adrenal fatigue or adrenal insufficiency. And this may be more, this may come up more premenopausally or perimenopausal, because remember from the previous episodes, as we get a bit older and our ovaries are not making the progesterone anymore, or even decreasing the amount of estrogen, our adrenals take over. They don't have such a smooth fine-tuning ability as our ovaries once did. I see allergies, so even asthma, hives, rashes, sinus congestion. So back to the allergies. And it gets a little tricky here, because those can be both signs of excess estrogen as well as insufficient estrogen. And this is why it's really important to run labs. Things like autoimmune disorders, same thing, driven by hyperestrogenism or estrogen dominance, as well as insufficient estrogen. And this is important when we look at these symptoms and we're starting to check off the boxes and say, oh, I am definitely estrogen dominant. And I've had so many women come to my office where they definitely sounded very estrogen dominant, and we ran the labs and they were anything but estrogen dominant. They were actually estrogen deficient, and they were progesterone dominant. We'll talk more about progesterone dominance in a future episode, but I just want to really emphasize the importance of making sure you're actually treating the correct values. Other things that are common are breast tenderness, fibrocystic breasts. I see a lot of fibrocystic breast in my women that are estrogen dominant, especially when they're younger. And this, again, these are estrogens that our body is making, but also estrogens that are being driven by these xenoestrogens or toxicants that are driving up our internal mechanisms to make more estrogens via the route of endocrine disruption. Breast cancer, that's another one that we're seeing, and we have ER positive breast cancer, so that's estrogen receptor positive breast cancers. So the more estrogen from whatever source we're being exposed to, the more we stimulate those receptors, which then in turn causes more receptors to be put out on the surface, and then that causes overstimulation of the breast tissue and other tissues as well, and so then we can have a cancer development, especially if there's xenoestrogens and more of the inflammatory types of estrogen. I see a lot of gallbladder disease with estrogen dominance. So when I have women that are estrogen dominant, they're much more likely to have gallbladder pain, sludge in their gallbladder, or gallbladder stones, or have had a gallbladder attack in the past. And if you recall, one of the ways we detoxify hormones is actually through our liver, which, how does our liver get rid of toxins? Through the bile, which then goes into the gallbladder. And when our gallbladder is full of particulates of these toxicants, right, they start coalescing. And if we're not flushing things really well because we have a sluggish digestion, it all sits there and then creates gallbladder stones. So that's common there. Blood sugar dysregulation can be another sign. elevated blood clots or increased risk of blood clots. We know that probably we've heard some advertisement for birth control and the warning if you're a smoker to avoid because of the increased risk of blood clots. That's because excess estrogen actually does increase blood clotting. So that's a really important factor to take into consideration, and why it's actually really important to look at your hormones and to not just let these symptoms go and say, oh, they'll go away when I'm in menopause. It's something we want to take care of as soon as possible. First off, because it's so important for your health, for your brain health, your cardiovascular health, and brain health. Think strokes, right? Increased stroke risk with increased blood clotting and inflammation. Same with cardiac events, heart attacks. It's important. But also because if you're having estrogen dominant and you're having heavy, painful periods, there's really no need to have those. It's so important to get rid of that. If you're trying to conceive, having estrogen dominance or hormonal imbalances is not great for conception and even pregnancy. And then we don't want to pass all of the excess estrogens on to our babies once we've birthed them. Thyroid dysfunction. That's one that I wanted to mention. So thyroid is actually closely co-regulated with our female hormones, including estrogen. Estrogen actually has effects on our thyroid gland. So when we have higher amounts of estrogen, that actually does suppress the TSH because the estrogen is stimulating our thyroid hormone. So sometimes I see women with thyroids that are imbalanced, and it's because their hormones are imbalanced, whether that is from hormone replacement therapy, which is actually another way that we can become estrogen dominant, is an imbalanced hormone replacement therapy protocol. But that does have effects on the thyroid gland. Even when our estrogen is low or drops too low, that can affect the output of our thyroid hormone. So a lot of times, actually all the time, when I work with my patients, I make sure that I actually look at not just female hormones, but also thyroid hormones as we're adjusting either of those, because they will have effects on one another. And sometimes when we're really estrogen dominant, then I may work with somebody for a while on just balancing their female hormones before rechecking thyroid or before adjusting a thyroid medication. And vice versa. Sometimes if a patient is on thyroid medication and it hasn't been appropriately managed or it could be improved, sometimes we won't even check their hormones, because I know that as I adjust thyroid hormone medication, their female hormones are going to most likely improve, because obviously we're going for improvement here. So especially when somebody's paying cash, I want to make sure and be mindful of what we're ordering and have a stepwise approach. But it's really important to take the entire endocrine system into consideration, because if you turn one spoke of the wheel, the other's going to turn with it. So looking at a complete picture. Unfortunately, estrogen dominance really does go unrecognized for so many years. And I have women that come in postmenopausally, and we're going through their life story when I'm doing a functional medicine timeline with them. And they're telling me about their menstrual cycle, and all I hear is estrogen dominance. And now they're coming to me with an autoimmune condition that, had the estrogen dominance been controlled, or whatever was driving the estrogen dominance, then maybe we wouldn't be having this autoimmune condition. So even postmenopausally, I've seen women with absolutely no hormone replacement therapy still show up as estrogen dominant, and a lot of them unfortunately get dismissed in the conventional world because they're postmenopausal. So why would we run your hormones? If you don't want hormone replacement therapy, why bother looking? Well, because information is knowledge, is power, and it's important when we understand how our body functions and what we can affect when we are the locus of control, right? That internal locus of control, we see what is driving this, we can modify that, and so therefore we can impact and improve our health outcomes and longevity with that. So that was a little side note, little soapbox there, because I just see so many patients where they could have had such an improved quality of life had their estrogen dominance been addressed. And sometimes estrogen dominance is addressed by giving women birth control pills, because that is the tool of choice in the allopathic system. And hey, time and a place, and I love that we have tools, but I have a really big toolbox. So instead of just putting a Band-Aid on it, which is what birth control really is, it masks estrogen dominance by giving you synthetic hormones to then re-regulate or override your native endocrine system. So what I do is actually I look at the underlying cause, what's driving it, and then we reverse that, whether that is toxicant exposure, things like mold. Molds are very estrogenic. So I see a lot of estrogen dominance and inflammation with mold exposure. Phthalates, BPA. I mean, this is where the environmental toxins come in. I'll spare you the entire list. And then heavy metals can dysregulate the endocrine system. And so they can also throw off that estrogen balance. Beyond that, your gut, your microbiome may actually also be affecting your estrogen metabolism. And that's one point that I haven't touched on yet, is another way we can experience estrogen dominance is actually in the metabolites of the estrogens. So our body creates estrogens, generally three forms: estrone, estradiol, and estriol, E3. So E1, E2, and E3. E3 estriol is usually only present during pregnancy in noteworthy numbers because it's very protective, it's very soothing, so that's where we want it. I generally don't see that elevated, but estradiol and estrones are the primary players from the endocrine system, and then our body detoxifies these estrogen through phase 1, where we make these a lot more fat soluble. And before they go into phase 2, where we make them water soluble and easy to excrete, these become metabolites, fat soluble metabolites, if our microbiome is imbalanced and we have a lot of beta glucuronidase. So this is one of the enzymes that actually re-releases. Once it's been through phase 2 and in the gut, it will re-release the estrogens that were bound, and they're actually much more toxic. So it's really important to look at metabolites of estrogens because they can actually be much more stimulating. So sometimes I have patients come to me and I run their blood labs and their estrogen to progesterone ratio looks beautiful, cycle day 19 through 21. I may do another cycle day 3 and check estrogen there early on in the menstrual cycle. If those are looking normal and nothing is out of balance, as in progesterone looks good, both estrone and estradiol look great, I will take the next step and actually run a Dutch panel. So this is a dried urine technology test, which is really nice because it looks at these estrogen metabolites as well as progesterone and testosterone. I always get a complete hormone picture because, why look at one corner of the puzzle when you can look at the whole picture? I think that's a lot better. And sometimes I'll repeat blood work in conjunction with one of these dried urine tests because that way I'm looking in multiple compartments at the same time. So looking at the metabolites can then also show, oh, you may not have a, estrogen dominance of estrone or estradiol, but the metabolites are elevated and hyperstimulating you. So that's a detoxification step that needs to be addressed, which wouldn't then actually be any better with addition of progesterone or the traditional things that we would use to pull down estrogen. So there are very specific supplements for each pathway within the detox cascade. And then I have had patients, this happens, where blood levels were fine and the metabolites were fine, and then we end up running a salivary hormone test, which is really interesting because now we're looking at 3 different compartments. So salivary hormones actually looks at what are your tissues being exposed to of these active metabolites, the estrone, the estradiol, the progesterone, testosterone. And sometimes that can paint a different picture because, we have all these hormones and we have sex hormone binding globulin that shuttles them around. And then we have all these other reasons for potential dissociations and metabolites and downstream effects. So sometimes that is a place where we can say or see, oh, okay, so your tissues are experiencing estrogen dominance, even though in blood levels they look fine. That honestly has only happened one time where we had to go to the salivary panel. And that was mostly for curiosity. We're actually already treating it because, hey, even if you have normal blood levels of estrogen and your metabolites look fine and you're having symptoms of estrogen dominance, I will be treating you for estrogen dominance and, using my judgment to make sure that, what's the best thing to do? Should we raise progesterone? Should we lower estrogen? How are we, or are we improving your detoxification pathways? So what should you do if you're actually suspecting estrogen dominance? Real simple, make an appointment. That would be step one. Now, I do have the option for my patients or for people listening to this podcast to actually order their own dried urine test, their hormone panel, which I think is really empowering because it does give a really good insight for you to see, are these metabolites elevated? Should I expect estrogen, or should I suspect estrogen dominance or progesterone deficiency? Or is there something else going on, like elevated cortisol levels? So that's one thing you can do. You could do one of these dried urine tests, which are really, really helpful. You could make an appointment with your doctor. You can have them run your labs, cycle day 19 through 21. What I generally recommend doing for hormone blood work is actually running cycle day 19 through 21 after the first day of your last menstrual cycle. I run estrone, which is E1, estradiol, testosterone total and free. I run progesterone and sex hormone binding globulin, as well as DHEAS, and that's kind of my standard hormone panel. I may run FSH and LH just to see if somebody might be perimenopausal. It gives me a little bit of a clue, although usually those are better run at different times in the cycle, but it's still a snapshot and it may help. And again, I might also add in thyroid, so that's TSH, free T3, free T4, reverse T3, and then I'm always checking iodine because I've been seeing so much iodine deficiency, and iodine is really important in the detox pathways, amongst other things, mostly by driving your thyroid in and helping it function the right way. So those are a couple of things that you can do in terms of testing. So you can always ask your primary care provider if they're open to running those labs. Sometimes they are, which is wonderful, and other times they're not. If you are curious about a personalized workup, you can always schedule a 15-minute free consult with me, and we can see what the best way is for us to work together. I'm always happy to be on a consultant basis. So if somebody's not in California, I definitely do health consultations in which we, still do an intake, everything that I would do with a patient, and then I just give you recommendations to obviously discuss with your primary care provider. If you're in California, we could potentially set up a plan for you, and then I could order some labs. So there are so many options. If you are feeling really lost, just reach out. You can DM me on Instagram at Divine Woman Wellness. That's divine_woman_wellness. And we can figure out what would be a good way to get you to the next steps. Now, like I said, there are a lot of places where we would look to see how we can optimize your hormone balance and to really understand whether this is estrogen dominance or not. Now, there are a couple of things that you can incorporate in your life, in your dietary intake. So again, I think it was episode maybe 2 where I did seed cycling. Seed cycling is actually really, really nice because it supports your hormonal balance. Seeds are very high in fiber. They improve bowel function, and they nourish your microbiome, as well as giving you nutrients that are really important for supporting healthy hormone balance. So especially if you're adding in the fish oils and the evening primrose oil, that's going to be such a nice support in the meantime to start regulating your hormones. And honestly, a lot of times my women or my female patients that come in with estrogen dominance, while we're waiting on the lab results, I've already started them on seed cycling, and by the time they come back, they're already feeling much better, much more balanced. The other thing that's really important is stop the xenoestrogen exposure. So, and also sugar balance, right? So improving your dietary intake, something that is a little bit more glycemically balanced is important. High fiber, colorful foods. So think lots of seasonal veggies. Fibrous veggies are great. Less on the non-starchy veggies. We want a little bit less of those because those do drive blood sugar dysregulation in high quantities. We want to make sure and have adequate protein in our dietary intake because that's really important for supporting phase 2 detoxification. So if you combine seed cycling with dietary balance, we're improving our gut microbiome, our detoxification pathways. That is such an important starting point before we even before we get started. So the thing that I was saying where I got a little distracted is get the xenoestrogens out of your environment. So listen to the previous 2 episodes, episodes 9 and 10, where I talk about toxins in our environment as well as toxins in our hygiene products. So definitely if you're having uterine symptoms like fibroids, cramping, definitely make sure you're not exposed to PFAS or BPA in any of your hygiene products. And then in your environment, right? Let's get the toxins out. These are the lotions and the potions, the things that are less than natural. We want to make sure and not slather our body in things that are containing things like BPA or other endocrine disruptors, which we find unfortunately in a lot of the lotions that we think smell really nice, but scents, perfumes, fragrances, those are endocrine disruptors. And so that is one of the top things that I ask all my patients to do is go all natural, get clean products. If you want some recommendations, I'm happy to give those to you. Actually, I'll see if I can find a little source for you. There's already a lot of information in my clean living or my toxin-free living ebook, so I would highly recommend downloading that. The link will be in the show notes for you to go ahead and download that if you haven't already. And then also, if you wanted to, I do have some Amazon products that I recommend, like the Ilia makeup brand, which is nice and clean. Deep Living is actually a company by my absolute best friend. It is designed to be toxin-free. Her salve is wonderful. I actually use that mostly, I actually don't really use anything else on my skin. I use her salve on my skin, and she does have a really, really nice moisturizer. All of them are toxin-free. I can put her link down in the bottom. You get a little discount with the code Dr. Kapersky. It's spelled out in the show notes. And I just want to make sure that we're not putting more toxins on our skin that are disrupting our hormones, because I've worked with so many patients, calcium D-glucarate, DIM, these are some common supplements, all these detoxes people are doing. But if you're continuously putting the toxins on your system that are driving the estrogen dominance, we're not going to make a lot of progress, unfortunately. The other thing that I would recommend that's really important for balancing hormones is a balanced eat-sleep cycle. Make sure you're getting to bed on time. Avoid screen time late at night, the sleep hygiene. And then also make sure you're getting fuel. Fuel your system. Keep a balanced level of blood sugar, right? We want to have good balanced blood sugar because that helps our hormones be more stable, because then we're not having so many cortisol surges. And even those cortisol surges can disrupt our menstrual cycle. I'm sure we've all had a time in our life where we were more stressed and either we were having our period more frequently or it was just completely gone. And so that does disrupt your endocrine system. All right, so that was a lot for today, and let me know if you want more specifics. We can always dive deeper. I love doing super deep dives, but I also know it gets really complicated when we start going down pathways. And one of my passions in life is, and one of the reasons I'm doing this podcast is because I want to make this information be in bite-sized snippets that's easy to digest, and that includes actionable items. Okay, so I want to keep it as simple as possible, but also as empowering as possible with actionable steps. So today in the show notes, you'll see the link for my Toxin-Free Living ebook. A reminder to go listen to my seed cycling episode and to implement the seed cycling. If you're having any hormonal imbalances, to start regulating things. And then if you feel called to do so, I would absolutely love a rate and review on wherever you're listening. And then if you would share this episode on your social media, make sure to tag me. If you have a favorite snippet from the episode, go ahead and pop it up on the World Wide Web. Yes, I've just dated myself. That's okay. Laughter, it's the best medicine. And I can definitely laugh at myself. But yes, if we have a favorite moment of the episode or something that you learned or a takeaway that you have from this episode, if you want to share it over on Instagram, I would be delighted to see you tag me, and let's get this conversation started and let's keep it going. All right, I hope you have a beautiful day.